The sound of glass clinking against wood was the only thing that broke the stillness in the room. Sunlight slipped through the half-closed blinds, painting thin golden lines across the old photographs on the wall, a lifetime framed and fading. Either serve my husband or leave this house. Rachel's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Edward Grant, 71, stood in the middle of his own living room, the leather recliner where his late wife Linda used to read, now occupied by his son-in-law Ethan Cole. The air smelled of beer and arrogance. Ethan didn't even glance up from the television. He simply smirked, lifting the bottle toward Edward as if commanding a servant. Edward's hands trembled not from fear, but from memory. For years he had paid their bills, their college tuition, even the mortgage that bore his name. And now his daughter, the little girl who once hid behind him during thunderstorms, was standing beside the man who disrespected him, eyes cold, lips pressed in defiance. He wanted to shout. Instead, he smiled. "All right," he said quietly, his voice steady as stone. He turned, walked down the hall lined with photographs of Linda, and reached for the old suitcase they had bought for their honeymoon in Yellowstone. The metal clasps clicked like the sound of a door closing, not just on a house, but on a chapter of his life. As he stepped out into the fading afternoon light, Rachel's voice followed him. "You'll regret this, Dad." Edward smiled again. No, he thought. They will. What happens when a father's silence becomes his greatest weapon? Setup. The next afternoon, the sky over Asheville hung low and heavy, a blanket of soft gray pressing against the mountains. Edward Grant's old Buick hummed quietly along the narrow road leading out of his neighborhood. He didn't look back. The rearview mirror showed only clouds and distance, the past shrinking into something mercifully small. Inside his chest, the silence throbbed. It wasn't anger that filled him. Anger had burned out years ago, smothered under the weight of politeness and family duty. What he felt now was something colder, cleaner resolve. He could still picture the house on Maple Avenue, every inch of it, etched into memory. The oak floors, Linda insisted on refinishing herself the kitchen window, where morning light once poured in golden ribbons, the old recliner she'd bought him for his birthday, the same one Ethan now claimed as his throne. Every detail of that house carried Linda's fingerprints, yet somehow in the years since her passing it had become someone else's domain. Ethan Cole had moved in 2 years after Linda's funeral. At first, Edward had been grateful that Rachel wasn't alone. The young man had a salesman's smile and easy charm, the kind that convinced people he was reliable before he ever proved it. But charm fades quickly when it's fed by someone else's wallet. Ethan had a habit of sitting barefoot in the recliner, leaving beer bottles on the table, muttering about deserving respect while using Edward's Wi-Fi and credit cards. Rachel pretended not to notice. She was always good at pretending. He remembered one particular Saturday, groceries heavy in his hands, the spring sunlight cutting across the living room. Ethan didn't even glance up from the basketball game. "Grab me a Corona while you're at it," he said lazily. Edward blinked. "Excuse me?" Ethan gestured toward the fridge. "You heard me? Not that cheap stuff you drink." Edward's fingers tightened on the grocery bags. For a moment, he saw himself from the outside, a 71-year-old man carrying beer for his daughter's husband in a house with his own name on the deed. Something inside him cracked. "That's enough," he said quietly. Ethan finally looked up, his smirk widening. "What's the big deal, old man? You're already standing. The big deal." Edward replied, voice steady, as that this is my house. Rachel walked in just then, her hair tied messily, a dish towel slung over one shoulder. "What's going on?" she asked. "Your father's being difficult," Ethan said without missing a beat. "I asked for a beer. He's making it a whole federal case." Rachel sighed, that tired, disappointed sigh she'd perfected over the years. "Dad, just get him the beer. It's not worth arguing over." Edward's heartbeat thudded, slow and deliberate. There it was, the shift, the moment he realized that no amount of generosity would ever buy him respect again. Ethan stood towering over him. "Here's how this works," he said, stepping closer. "You live in our house. You contribute. That means when I ask you to do something, you do it. No attitude, no questions." "Our house?" The words hit harder than any shove. Rachel moved beside her husband, folding her arms. "Dad, you need to decide right now. Either help Ethan or pack your things." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Edward looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw only the echo of the girl who used to bring him wildflowers from the yard. Somewhere between weddings and mortgages, that child had vanished. "All right," he said finally. Ethan grinned triumphant. "Good. Now about that beer I'll pack." Edward interrupted. The grin faltered. Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came. Edward walked past them without another glance. He moved through the hallway like a ghost, the walls lined with photos of Linda, her smile bright eternal. He could almost hear her voice. "Don't raise your voice, Ed. Raise your standards." In the bedroom, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old perfume. He pulled the worn suitcase from the closet shelf. The metal latch stuck for a moment before snapping open with a sound that felt final. He packed methodically: shirt, socks, the framed photo of Linda from their Yellowstone trip, a small leather notebook where he tracked expenses, the blood pressure pills he never missed. Each item represented a lifetime of discipline, of responsibility that no one seemed to notice anymore. From the living room came hushed voices, Rachel's soft pleading, Ethan's sharp retorts. Edward ignored them. The zipper closed with a slow rasp, and that sound alone felt more powerful than any argument. When he rolled the suitcase down the hall, both of them fell silent. Ethan stood stiff, trying to look in control. Rachel's eyes glistened with uncertainty. Neither spoke as he passed them. The Buick started on the first try. It always did. He reversed out of the driveway, not looking back at the window where Rachel used to wave as a little girl. The neighborhood slid by in slow motion. The old oak tree he'd planted when Rachel was 5, the postbox Linda painted blue. He drove toward downtown Asheville, past the bank where he'd worked 35 years, past the coffee shop where he and Linda used to share muffins after church. Every street corner whispered a version of his life that no longer existed. He did the math in his head as he drove: $40,000 for Rachel's degree at Belmont College, $25,000 for the wedding when Ethan's parents forgot to contribute, $80,000 pulled from his retirement to help them buy the house on Maple Avenue, monthly mortgage top-ups, utilities, groceries, another $2,000 each month disappearing into their lives like clockwork. He had convinced himself it was love. That's what fathers did, after all. They gave and gave until giving became their identity. But tonight the ledger would finally balance. The Blue Ridge Motel sat at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering between blue and nothing. The building was small, 12 rooms lined in faded green paint, a parking lot cracked with weeds. Edward parked near the office, checked in with a polite woman who didn't ask questions, and carried his suitcase into room 7. Inside, the space was clean but bare: a single bed, a wooden chair, a small table by the window. He sat on the edge of the mattress and let the silence settle. For the first time in years, there were no footsteps above him, no television noise, no one asking for money. He opened his laptop, the familiar hum of the fan filling the room. The screen glowed with numbers, checking savings, retirement. His life reduced to balances and decimals, each dollar a memory of hours worked, clients satisfied, sacrifices unnoticed. He stared at the cursor blinking in the search bar. Tomorrow, he thought, the balance will finally shift. He reached for the framed photo of Linda, tracing her smile with his thumb. "You were right," he whispered. "Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness at all." Outside, rain began to fall against the window, soft, steady, cleansing. Edward leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and let the rhythm of the rain mark the beginning of something new. What would you do if the people you loved treated your home like theirs? Backstory. The motel room was still. Only the hum of the small refrigerator filled the space, steady, mechanical, indifferent. Edward sat by the window, the photo of Linda propped against a glass of water. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the faint scent of asphalt and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a train groaned through the valley. He remembered another night long ago in the same mountains when life had felt unbreakable. Linda had been sitting beside him on the porch swing, her hair pulled into that loose bun she favored when she was painting. "You spoil them, Ed," she'd said, half laughing, half serious. "One day they'll forget how to stand on their own." He'd smiled, pretending not to hear. "It's called being a father." She'd tapped his chest with a paint-stained finger. "No, it's called being afraid to be alone." The words stung then. They echoed now. They had built the Asheville house together after the war, the same one he just walked away from. He'd handled the paperwork and bank loans. She had chosen every curtain and light fixture, insisting that warmth was more important than fashion. The house was meant to hold laughter, not entitlement. When cancer came, it arrived quietly. At first, they treated it like an unwelcome guest, something that could be managed with optimism and medication. But the optimism ran out before the medication did. He could still picture the hospital room bathed in sterile blue light, Linda's hand small and cold in his. "Promise me something," she'd whispered, voice thin as paper. "Anything. Promise me you won't let them take your peace. Not Rachel, not anyone. You've spent your whole life fixing things. Let some of them stay broken." He had promised. He had meant it. But promises are easy when you don't yet know what loneliness costs. After the funeral, the house turned silent in a way that felt predatory. He'd kept the TV on just to fill the emptiness. When Rachel called months later, her voice sweet and concerned, "Dad, you shouldn't be alone." "Let us move in for a while." He'd said yes before thinking. Ethan had carried boxes into the living room, smiling, politely shaking his hand. "We'll help out with everything, Mr. Grant." At first it had seemed true. Rachel cooked, Ethan mowed the lawn. Laughter returned to the hallways. But then small things began to shift a bill here, a favor there, a credit card payment, just until payday. Edward didn't mind. He told himself Linda would have wanted him to help, but Linda had also been practical. She believed generosity without boundaries was a kind of slow suicide. He remembered the night the first argument happened, not with Ethan, but with Rachel. He had questioned why she needed another loan for a temporary setback. She'd crossed her arms and said, "You can't take it with you, Dad." He'd looked at her then, and for a moment the girl who once built blanket forts in the living room vanished, replaced by a woman who spoke like a stranger. Now, sitting in the motel, he felt the weight of that transformation. It wasn't sudden. It was built brick by brick, payment by payment, until the foundation of love had turned into debt. He picked up the photo of Linda again. The frame was cracked at one corner, the result of an old move years ago. Her smile was steady, knowing as if she'd seen this moment coming. "You were right, dear," he whispered, voice breaking just slightly. "I raised dependents, not family." He set the picture on the bedside table and turned off the lamp. The darkness didn't frighten him this time. It felt honest, clean in its emptiness. Tomorrow, he decided he would begin again. Not as the father who gave endlessly, but as the man Linda had asked him to be, someone who finally understood that peace isn't given, it's taken back. Echoes, Conflict, Part 1. Ichite. The morning came gray and cold, sunlight dulled by low clouds pressing against the Blue Ridge Mountains. Edward woke early, long before the cleaning staff began their quiet shuffle down the hall. The motel clock blinked 6:12 a.m. He sat at the small table by the window, spreading a neat pile of papers across its scratched surface. Mortgage statements, insurance policies, bank account summaries, and a worn leather notebook filled with 30 years of careful notes. He ran his fingers over the numbers as if they were scars. Every line told a story of generosity disguised as duty. He reached for his phone, dialed the first number on his list, First National Bank of Asheville. "Good morning, Mr. Grant," the automated voice said. "How can we assist you today?" Edward followed the prompts until a real voice came through, a young representative, polite and chipper. "How can I help you, sir?" "I'd like to cancel an automatic mortgage payment," Edward said evenly. "Certainly. Which property address?" 153 Maple Avenue, account ending in 4729. A pause. The sound of keys tapping. "That's been active for 5 years, sir. Are you sure you want to discontinue it?" "I'm sure." "May I ask the reason for the change?" "The homeowners no longer qualify for my financial assistance." The clicking resumed, slower now, cautious. "Understood. You'll receive confirmation by mail within 3 business days." "Thank you," Edward said. When the call ended, he exhaled. It wasn't satisfaction he felt, not exactly, but relief, as though some invisible weight had shifted off his chest. Next came the insurance company, then the credit card providers. Each call a small, deliberate act of liberation. "I need to remove 2 vehicles from my policy." "Yes, sir, effective today. I'd like to remove an authorized user from this card. Any outstanding balance will remain yours, but she won't be able to make new charges." "That's perfectly fine." By noon, his notepad was filled with confirmation numbers, dates and reference codes, a paper trail of independence. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and whispered, "That's enough for one lifetime." The phone buzzed twice before he silenced it. Rachel's name appeared followed by Ethan's. He didn't answer either. He imagined the scene unfolding at Maple Avenue, Ethan cursing at the bank's automated voice. Rachel pacing near the window, panic tightening her voice. They'd be blaming each other by now. He could almost hear it. That evening, the messages began to arrive, voicemails dripping with confusion, then irritation, then rage. Dad, there must be some mistake with the mortgage. The bank says the payment bounced. Another one. Ethan's voice harsh and impatient. You need to fix this right now. The insurance lapsed. Do you have any idea what that does to my record? By the fifth message, the tone had shifted. Rachel's voice trembled, desperate now. Dad, please call me. The utility company says the payment stopped. I don't understand what's happening. He sat at the motel desk, listening to each one in sequence. His expression didn't change. When the final message ended with Ethan shouting, "You're making us look like deadbeats, old man," he pressed delete and closed his phone. For the first time in years, the silence that followed was peaceful. By the end of the week, the calls turned to knocks. It was Saturday morning when the sound echoed through his door, sharp, hurried. Edward didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. Dad, open up. Rachel's voice cracked on the last word. He opened the door halfway. She stood there in a wrinkled sweater, eyes red from crying. Ethan hovered behind her, hands jammed into his pockets, jaw tight. We need to talk, she said, about what Edward asked. Ethan stepped forward, his voice sharp, about the fact that you're trying to ruin our lives over some stupid argument about beer. Edward's expression remained calm. I'm not trying to ruin anything. I've simply stopped paying for your lives. You can't just stop paying the mortgage. Ethan's voice rose, echoing down the narrow hall. That's our house? Actually, Edward said quietly, it's my house. My name on the deed. My signature on the loan. You were guests. Rachel grabbed Ethan's arm, her voice trembling. Dad, please. We can work this out. We were wrong to yell, but you can't just walk away from us. Not like this. He looked at her, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. You gave me an ultimatum, Rachel. Serve my husband or leave. I simply chose the option you offered. Ethan took a step closer, fists tightening. Listen, you old. Don't, Edward said softly. If you raise your voice here again, I'll call the police. This is private property and you're disturbing the peace. They both froze, taken aback by the steadiness in his tone. Rachel's voice broke. What about family? What about everything we've been through? Family works both ways, Edward replied. I spent 5 years taking care of you. When it was time for you to take care of me, you chose him instead. Ethan's mask slipped. The sneer returned. You think you're some kind of hero? You're just bitter and alone. Edward smiled faintly. Maybe, but at least I earned my solitude. He began to close the door. Rachel's voice trembled softer now. Dad, wait. He paused only long enough to say, You wanted me gone. Now you have what you wanted. The door shut with a quiet click. Outside, the footsteps faded. Through the thin motel walls, he could hear Ethan muttering curses. Rachel's muffled sobs. Then silence again. Edward stood by the window watching as their car pulled away. The parking lot lights flickered, catching the reflection of his calm face in the glass. For years, he'd been the man who fixed things, the dependable one, the peacemaker. Now, for the first time, he was the problem they couldn't solve. He poured himself a cup of lukewarm motel coffee, sat back down and opened his notebook. On the next blank page, he wrote one sentence in tidy, deliberate handwriting. Freedom begins the moment you stop apologizing for other people's comfort. Then beneath it, he added a small note. Next step, reclaim the house legally. He closed the notebook, took a deep breath and smiled to himself. Sometimes justice doesn't come with anger, it comes with paperwork. The following Tuesday, Edward walked into the Main Street diner for his usual breakfast. Black coffee, 2 eggs, and quiet. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the familiar scent of bacon and maple syrup filled the air. He'd barely settled into his corner booth when a voice called out from across the room. Ed Grant. I'll be damned. He looked up. Robert Hayes, silver-haired, still carrying the confidence of a man who'd spent decades behind a bank desk, waved from near the window. They had worked together at First National before Robert's transfer. Edward stood to shake his hand. Bob, Been a long time. Since Linda's service, at least, Robert said, sliding into the seat across from him. You holding up all right? Edward gave the practiced half-smile of a man who had grown used to that question. Doing what I can. The waitress appeared with coffee. Robert waited until she left before lowering his voice. Listen, Ed. I probably shouldn't bring this up, but that son-in-law of yours, Ethan, he came into the bank a few months back. Edward frowned. For what? A home equity loan. On your house. The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. Robert continued, watching him carefully. 50,000, claimed the property was his, brought in paperwork and everything. Looked convincing at first, but when we ran the title search, it all traced back to you, clean as a whistle. No cosigners, no liens. Edward's hands tightened around his coffee cup. You're saying he forged it? Deliberately, Robert said. We flagged the file. I kept copies, figured you might want to see them. He pulled an envelope from his briefcase, sliding it across the table. Inside were photocopies, a fake deed with Ethan's signature, a false notary stamp. The audacity of theft made bureaucratic. When was this? Edward asked quietly. Late January. We didn't press charges since no money changed hands, but you should know he's been in financial trouble. Word is, he's got gambling debts, high ones. Edward nodded slowly. How high? Robert sighed. 18, maybe 20,000. He's been a regular at the casino up by Hendersonville. Poker tables mostly. You might talk to Detective James Morton. He's been tracking some of that activity. Edward stared at the papers, his pulse steady but his chest burning. The argument, the beer, the insults, all of it made a cruel kind of sense now. Ethan hadn't been asserting dominance. He'd been protecting his last resource. He folded the documents neatly and slid them into his briefcase. Thank you, Bob. Robert leaned forward. Be careful, Ed. A man willing to forge deeds might try worse when cornered. I'll keep that in mind. That afternoon, Edward drove to the Buncombe County Courthouse. The building loomed over the square, its red brick facade solid and dignified, a place built for decisions that outlasted tempers. Inside the clerk's office smelled of paper and patience. I need to file an eviction notice, he said to the woman at the counter. Name of the property owner, Edward Grant, and the tenants, Rachel Grant and Ethan Cole. She looked up from the form, her brows knitting. Sir, are they relatives? Yes, my daughter and her husband. The woman hesitated, her tone softening. That's always the hardest kind. Edward signed where instructed, his handwriting deliberate. Hard or not, it's necessary. When she asked for the reason for eviction, he didn't hesitate. Violation of verbal agreement, lack of respect and contribution. She stamped the papers with firm precision. The 30-day notice begins today. If they contest, there'll be a hearing. Otherwise, the sheriff will serve papers within 48 hours. Thank you, he said, collecting the copies. As he turned to leave, the clerk added quietly, For what it's worth, sir, I hope they realize what kind of man they're losing. Outside, the courthouse steps gleamed wet from a passing drizzle. He paused halfway down, feeling the weight of justice, not vengeance, settle over him like a coat that finally fit. His next stop was the police station. Detective James Morton's office was a cluttered space filled with old files and the scent of burnt coffee. Edward Grant Morton said, standing to shake his hand. Haven't seen you since the church fundraiser. What brings you in? Information, Edward said. Robert Hayes mentioned you might know something about Ethan Cole's gambling debts. Morton's expression turned professional. Your son-in-law. Yeah, I know the name. Regular at Blue Ridge Casino, usually poker. Not a great record. He owes money, more than he admits. I'm sure, Morton replied. 18 to 20 grand spread across 2 lenders. One legit, one not so much. We've had complaints, collection threats, but nothing criminal yet. Wouldn't surprise me if he's tried to use my property as leverage, Edward said. Morton nodded. That tracks. He also came in last month asking about adverse possession, the 5-year law that lets someone claim a property if they've lived there without permission. Edward blinked. He asked about that. Yep, he's been there 3 years, right? Another 2 and he'd try to file. Edward exhaled slowly. So he wasn't freeloading. He was building a case. Exactly. Morton tapped a file. I can keep a watch. And if he escalates, we'll have grounds for harassment or fraud. You just keep records, dates, messages, anything that shows his behavior pattern. I already started, Edward said. Files titled Ethan Cole Evidence. Morton smiled faintly, spoken like a banker. By the end of the week, word had spread through Asheville faster than rainwater down a mountain road. At the hardware store, at church, at the diner, everyone had heard variations of the same story, how Edward Grant had spent his retirement supporting his daughter and her husband, how he'd finally walked away. But Ethan wasn't idle. He fought back the only way he knew, with lies. He's losing it, he told anyone who'd listen. Old man's paranoid, claims we stole from him. He's having some kind of breakdown. Rachel followed the same script, though less convincingly. She added a new detail, that she was pregnant, that the stress might cause her to lose the baby. The town whispered in sympathy at first. Edward, however, had lived too long in the world of evidence to take anything at face value. He called Dr. Richards, Linda's old physician, and explained gently, "I need to confirm whether Rachel has had an appointment recently." The doctor's voice was firm. "Not in months." "Thank you," Edward said, and hung up. The confirmation hit harder than anger ever could. Manipulation had replaced honesty. He recorded the date and time of the call in his notebook. The retaliation came quickly. Saturday evening, as rain began to fall again, there was a pounding at the motel door, louder, angrier this time. Edward didn't open it. He simply watched through the peephole as Ethan stood outside, swaying slightly, face red from drink. "Come out, you old bastard," Ethan shouted. "You think you can embarrass me? You'll regret this." Edward picked up his phone, dialed the front desk. "Steve, could you have security check the hallway?" The motel manager, a retired Army sergeant, appeared minutes later. By then, Ethan had stormed off, muttering. Steve looked grim. "He's been pacing outside for 10 minutes. I've got him on camera. Keep the footage," Edward said. "The police will need it." The next morning, he delivered the USB drive to Detective Morton, along with his notes. Morton reviewed the file, then looked up. "This shows a clear pattern of harassment," he said. "Combined with the attempted fraud, you've got grounds for a restraining order. What would that do?" "Keep him 500 feet away from you or your property. Any violation means immediate arrest." Edward nodded. "Do it." Morton smiled slightly. "You've turned this into a textbook case, Ed. I'll have the order signed by the end of the day." That afternoon, Edward sat once more by the motel window. The restraining order folded neatly on the table beside his coffee. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the air sharp and clean. He could see his reflection faintly in the glass, older, yes, but steadier. A man who had spent a lifetime keeping the peace had finally learned the strength of quiet defiance. He opened his notebook and wrote the day's final entry. "Justice is quieter than revenge, but it lasts longer." Then he underlined it, once closed the book, and let the silence wash over him. His reflection. The days that followed felt strangely weightless. No more messages, no knocks on the door, no angry voices bleeding through the motel walls. Only quiet, the kind that didn't hurt anymore. Each morning, Edward Grant walked the streets of downtown Asheville, hands tucked into the pockets of his old wool coat. The city had changed since the years he'd worked at the bank. Coffee shops where hardware stores used to be murals painted on brick walls once gray with soot. Life had moved on, and now, finally, so had he. He passed the courthouse steps where he'd filed the eviction papers, the diner where he'd met Robert Hayes, the church where Linda's funeral had been held. Every place carried a ghost, but none of them asked him to stay. At a crosswalk, he watched two young fathers helping their kids across the street. The smallest boy tugged impatiently at his dad's sleeve, laughing about something Edward couldn't hear. It should have made him ache, but it didn't. It just made him grateful that love, real love, still existed somewhere. Back at the motel, he sat by the window with a cup of coffee and the photograph of Linda. "You'd laugh if you saw me now," he murmured. "Took me 71 years to learn boundaries." He opened his notebook. The last page still carried the line he'd written days ago. "Justice is quieter than revenge, but it lasts longer." He wrote underneath it in smaller letters, "Peace comes after the noise if you let it." That afternoon, Edward visited St. Mark's Church, the same place where he and Linda had volunteered on weekends. Pastor Williams was still there, a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "Edward Grant," he said warmly, extending a hand. "It's been too long." Edward smiled faintly. Too long and too much. They sat in the office where Linda's laughter still seemed to linger between the wooden shelves lined with hymnals. "I heard some things about your situation," Pastor Williams said gently. "I won't pry, but I wanted you to know you're not alone." Edward nodded. "It's strange, Pastor. I spent years thinking love meant paying for everything: tuition, weddings, mortgages. I thought sacrifice was proof of devotion. And now I see it was just fear. I was afraid that if I stopped giving, they'd stop needing me. That fear turned into a habit. And habits are hard to break when they make you feel useful." Pastor Williams leaned back in his chair. "Sometimes the kindest act is saying no." Edward chuckled softly. "Linda used to say the same thing, only I never listened. She was a wise woman. She still is," Edward said, glancing toward the stained glass window where light poured in like forgiveness. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was soft, not empty but full of understanding. Then Pastor Williams said, "You can still turn pain into purpose, Ed. You always were good at helping others. Maybe it's time to help people who understand what sacrifice truly means." Edward tilted his head. "You have someone in mind." "There's a group, the Veterans Housing Project. They're converting old homes into transitional housing for veterans and their families. They need donors not just for money but for property." The idea landed gently like a seed. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He sat by the motel window again, the rain tracing silver lines down the glass. The lights from the parking lot shimmered like small promises. He thought about his house, not as bricks and furniture, but as a symbol. It had started as a home for love, become a shelter for obligation, and ended as a battlefield of pride. Maybe it was time for it to mean something better. He whispered into the stillness, "If I can't rebuild what I lost, maybe I can build something new for someone else." He opened his notebook and began to write a new entry. "Donate the Maple Avenue house to the Veterans Housing Project. Transfer ownership after court approval. Linda always said service gives peace a home." When he finished, he underlined Linda's name twice. 2 days later, he met with Pastor Williams again, this time bringing a folder of legal documents. "I'm serious about the donation," Edward said. "I want the house to serve families who've earned their peace." The pastor's eyes softened. Linda would be proud. Maybe she already knows. They shared coffee afterward, talking about simple things, weather books, the stubbornness of aging. But beneath the small talk was something sacred: relief. Edward felt lighter than he had in years. That afternoon, he drove to Lake Junaluska, a quiet place Linda had loved. The autumn wind rippled across the surface, scattering sunlight like glass shards. He sat on a bench overlooking the water, notebook in his lap. He read through the pages he'd written over the last few weeks: anger, resolve, evidence, and now grace. The arc of a man finally learning the difference between control and peace. He found an empty page and wrote slowly, each word deliberate. "Freedom begins when generosity meets limits." He smiled, closing the notebook, feeling as though Linda herself had guided his hand. As the sun lowered behind the ridge, the lake turned gold. A heron drifted across the water, wings wide, its reflection perfectly mirrored below. Edward whispered, "I finally did it, Linda. I stopped giving away what was never mine to give my peace." He could almost hear her laughter in the wind, soft and approving. The thought made him chuckle. "Took me long enough." A moment later, he added quietly, "I think I'm ready to see Rachel again, not to fight, just to listen." The heron lifted off, disappearing into the fading light. Edward stood brushing the dust from his coat. "If truth still lives somewhere inside her," he said softly, "I'm ready to hear it." He walked back toward his car, the last light of day catching the silver in his hair. The world around him was quiet, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Would you give up your home to teach your family what dignity really means? Turning point. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and fried eggs, the scent of 1,000 quiet conversations. Edward arrived early, as he always did, choosing the corner booth that faced away from the street. He wanted this meeting to be private, without the curious eyes of Asheville peering through the glass. He ordered black coffee and waited, tracing the rim of the mug with one finger. Outside, the sky threatened rain again, and he wondered if storms simply followed him now out of habit. At 2:07, the door opened. Rachel stepped in her coat, too thin for the cold, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. She looked around until she spotted him. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, approaching like someone entering a confession. "Rachel." He greeted, nodding toward the seat across from him. "Sit down." She did, setting her purse on the bench beside her. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the menu, then thought better of it. "You look tired," Edward said. "I am," she admitted. It's a mess. Ethan lost his job. The collectors keep calling. We're 3 months behind on everything." Edward stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking gently. "I'm not surprised." She swallowed. "I know you warned us, and I know I said things I shouldn't have." He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "You said I should serve your husband or leave. Those weren't just things, Rachel. They were choices. I took you at your word." Her gaze dropped to the table. "I didn't mean it. Not like that. Intentions matter less than actions." She nodded weakly. "We've lost everything, Dad. The house, the car, the accounts. I don't even know where to start." He took a slow sip of coffee. "Start with the truth." "What truth?" "The one you've been avoiding." She frowned, confused. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do," he said quietly. "I'm offering you one chance to end this with dignity, not to fix it, not to undo it, just to face it." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "I want you to tell the truth," Edward continued, publicly, about everything, the money, the house, the ultimatum. Her face paled. "You're asking me to humiliate myself." He shook his head. "No, I'm asking you to be honest. There's a difference. People will talk. They already do." Rachel's hands tightened around the napkin. "You don't understand what it's like. The shame, the looks, I understand perfectly." Edward interrupted, his tone still calm. "I lived with shame every day in my own home. I cleaned up after your husband while you looked away. I bought peace with money and you both spent it like it was infinite. But I was wrong too. I let it happen." Tears welled in her eyes. "Dad, please, I can't undo what we did. I don't need you to undo it. I need you to own it." She looked at him helplessly. "And if I do, then maybe one day we can start again. Not as father and dependent, but as two adults who respect each other." She bit her lip, voice trembling. "What if I can't? Then you'll live with the consequences of that choice like I lived with mine." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of rain began tapping softly against the window, slow and rhythmic. Finally, Rachel whispered, "You really don't want the house back, do you?" Edward studied her face, the exhaustion etched into every line. "No, Rachel. I'm done with houses that hold more noise than love." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folded document, sliding it across the table. "This is my new will." She hesitated before unfolding it. Her eyes scanned the lines and her breath caught. "The house. It's going to the Veterans Housing Project." "Yes," her voice rose slightly. "You're giving it away to strangers." "To people who know what sacrifice means," he said softly. "People who've earned their home, not demanded it." Rachel's tears spilled freely now. "Dad, that house has been in our family for generations." He nodded. "And for the first time, it'll serve the kind of family your mother would have been proud of." "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" He met her gaze, his eyes steady, unflinching. "Because I need to know that any love left between us is real. Not tied to inheritance, not measured in square footage. Just love." Rachel covered her face with both hands, shoulders shaking. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I really am." "I know," he said gently. "But sorry doesn't rebuild trust. It only opens the door to try." She lowered her hands, eyes red. "Then what do you want from me?" "Your honesty, in front of everyone. Sunday morning at church." Her breath caught. "You want me to tell them everything?" "Yes, the truth. That I paid your tuition, your wedding, your mortgage. That I left because you made me choose between my dignity and your husband's pride." Her lip quivered. "They'll never look at me the same." "Maybe not," Edward said quietly. "But they'll finally see you." She leaned back in the booth, defeated the rain outside, blurring the world beyond the window. "I don't know if I have the strength." "You do," he said. "Because I raised you to." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "Do you think you could ever forgive me?" Forgiveness. He smiled sadly. That came the day I walked out. But trust that has to be earned. Rachel nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. And if I do this, if I tell the truth? He folded his hands, voice steady as a verdict. Then, maybe one day we'll share coffee again, not as strangers pretending to be family, but as family learning to be honest. She exhaled shakily, then whispered, "How long do I have?" "Until Sunday morning," he said, 10 o'clock. "If you still have truth left in you, I'll see it then." Rachel rose from her seat, clutching her purse. She looked smaller than he remembered, not the defiant woman who'd thrown him out, but the daughter who used to bring him dandelions in spring. "Goodbye, Dad," she said quietly. "For now," he replied. She hesitated at the door, glancing back once before stepping into the rain. The diner bell chimed softly behind her. Edward watched until her figure disappeared down the street. Then he turned his gaze to the window, where droplets slid slowly down the glass like the passage of time itself. He whispered, "Sunday will tell the truth for both of us." Cliffhanger, cititis. Sunday morning arrived cold and brilliant sunlight slicing through the stained glass windows of St. Mark's Church like shards of colored truth. The sanctuary filled slowly, whispers spreading through the pews. Everyone had heard that something was about to happen. Edward sat in the third row, his hands folded over the same worn Bible he'd carried for 40 years. He hadn't spoken to Rachel since their meeting at the diner. He didn't know if she would come. Pastor Williams began the service, his voice calm, familiar. Hymns rose like soft waves, but beneath the melody tension hummed the kind that precedes revelation. Then, just before the benediction, the pastor paused. "Before we close, there's someone who wishes to speak." All eyes turned as Rachel stood from the back row. Her hands trembled slightly, but her shoulders were squared. She walked down the aisle, each step echoing against the polished wood floor. When she reached the podium, she gripped the edges to steady herself. For a moment, the sanctuary held its breath. "I need to tell you all something about my father," she began. Her voice wavered, then grew stronger. "For 5 years, my husband and I lived in a house my father paid for. He covered our mortgage, our bills, our insurance, everything. He gave us more than we ever deserved." A murmur rippled through the congregation, and when he stopped, we didn't thank him. We gave him an ultimatum. Her throat tightened. Serve my husband or leave his own home, and he left with nothing but a suitcase and his dignity. Tears blurred her vision, but she pressed on. I stood by and watched it happen. I told myself he'd forgive us, that it wasn't that bad, but it was, because it showed who I'd become, someone who confused comfort with love. The room was silent, except for her quiet sobs. My father taught me what generosity meant, but I repaid him with arrogance. I can't change that. I can only tell the truth. She looked toward Edward, sitting 3 rows away. Their eyes met not as judge and sinner, but as two people finally speaking the same language. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said. "And I know that's not enough, but I'm ready to earn your forgiveness one honest step at a time." For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then Pastor Williams stepped forward, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes the hardest courage is truth. Thank you, Rachel." As she returned to her seat, the congregation broke into soft applause. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to fill the room with grace. Edward stood slowly. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once, a small gesture that said more than words could. Outside, after the service, the crisp mountain air felt alive again. People approached him. Mrs. Henderson from the church committee, Tom from the hardware store, even the bank teller who'd once processed his mortgage. Each one offered the same thing: respect. "That took real strength," Tom said. "Both of you." Edward smiled faintly. Strength doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it's just walking away. As the crowd thinned, Rachel approached him. Her cheeks were flushed from crying, but her eyes were clear. "Ethan's gone," she said quietly. "Packed his truck yesterday. No note. Just left." Edward nodded. "I'm sorry it ended that way." "I'm not," she said. "He'd been gambling with my credit cards. The debts were worse than I thought." Edward sighed. "Then it's time to stop rebuilding the wrong house." She managed a faint smile. I filed for divorce this morning. The words hung in the crisp air like a prayer answered. 3 months later, Edward stood on the front lawn of his former home, now transformed into the Veterans Housing Initiative. The house had been divided into 3 units, warm, bright spaces for families starting over. Children's laughter floated from the backyard where a small playground had been built. A young Mother Staff Sergeant Maria Santos approached her 2 kids clinging to her sides. "Mr. Grant, thank you. This place, it means a fresh start for us." Edward smiled. "That's all I ever wanted, this house to be a place for new beginnings." He handed her the keys, feeling no sadness, only release. Later that evening, he returned to his cabin by Lake Junaluska, where sunlight turned the water into sheets of gold. He sat on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the ripples move like quiet breath. His phone buzzed. A text from Rachel's dad. "I'm in counseling, learning how to be a better person. Could we have coffee soon? I'd like to earn your trust back." Edward read it twice, smiling softly. He typed back, "Coffee sounds good. Saturday morning, same diner." A pause, then another message arrived. "Thank you for not giving up on me." He set the phone aside and looked across the lake. The wind stirred, carrying the faint sound of children laughing from the distance. He whispered, "Forgiveness is easy. Earning trust takes time." The sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. The reflection shimmered across the lake like a second chance. Edward closed his eyes and smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because it no longer needed to be. Voices fade, but dignity lasts longer. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to choose peace over family? Thank you for listening.